Mexico Profundo, Reclaiming a Civilization. This is a book written by Guillermo Bonfil Batalla, who was a Mexican anthropologist. He wrote this book with the hope of reaching a broader audience as opposed to solely an academic audience, with two main aims. The first aim is to provide an overview of the continuity of Mesoamerican civilization and the multiple ways it continues to be present in Mexico. The second aim of the book is to explore the question of what does it mean for two civilizations, namely the Mesoamerican civilization and the Western civilization, to coexist in the same space and time? And what are the potential implications of this coexistence for our present and future? For the first aim, Bonfil Batalla provides an overview of the continuity of Mesoamerican civilization, which arises directly from the invention of agriculture in the valleys of central Mexico between 5,000 and 7,500 years ago, with the domestication of beans, squashes, chiles, tomatillo, curds, avocado, and corn or maize. And it is the cultivation of corn that becomes the major agricultural achievement of Mesoamerican culture. As corn can only grow with human intervention because the corn cob has no mechanism to disperse its seeds without human help. Bonfil Batalla argues that the Mesoamerican civilization is the starting point and the most profound aspect of Mexico, and that there is a common history of continuity between the invention of corn cultivation, Mesoamerican civilization, and Mexico. For example, since the start of Mesoamerican civilization, people have continued to adapt to a variety of ecological environments. So much that there is hardly any landscape within Mexico that hasn't been transformed by humans. Almost everywhere you look in Mexico, there is always evidence of human presence. And the transformation of these environments has been to facilitate the task of agricultural practices, particularly milpa agriculture, which in turn started the accumulation of knowledge and systematic experiences of centuries regarding ways of understanding the natural world, social and daily life organization, and cultural values. A concrete example is seen in people's housing, with houses usually located adjacent to cornfields, and even in the space within the homes, which was arranged to indicate the importance of corn with a designated space to store corn. And also a metate, mainly used to make tortillas, which also function as a space for the family to eat and talk and discuss daily events. And these are practices that continue today. Now to the second aim of the book, which is again to explore the question of what does it mean for two civilizations to coexist in the same space and time, and what are the potential implications of this coexistence for our present and our future. An example of the implications of the coexistence that Bonfil Batalla refers to is the permanent confrontation between people wanting to move towards westernization or so called progress and people who are resisting westernization by remaining rooted in the continuity of Mesoamerican culture. Westernization, in the context of this book, refers to a process that started since the arrival of European colonization and a process that has been ongoing with the goal of subordinating indigenous populations. One of the strategies used to achieve this goal of westernization has been through an indigenous ethnocide. This refers to the systematic erasure of anything indigenous and is a practice that remains till this day, sometimes in overt or covert ways. As Bonfil Batalla mentions that just because Mexico was able to gain its independence from Spain, it did not mean that the internal colonial structure was ever eliminated. As a result of not being able to eliminate the colonial structure of in Mexico, Bonfil Batalla argues that the imaginary Mexico was created. The imaginary Mexico is defined as being exclusionary, denying the value and validity of Mesoamerican civilization, and fueling the project of westernization. Particular to the Mexican context, the main form of indigenous ethnocide has been the process of de Indianization, which again refers to the colonial systematic attempt to forcibly erase an original collective indigenous identity of Mesoamerican origin that existed prior to European colonization, such that people are forced to renounce to their identity. Not as a result of biological mixture, but as a result of an ethnocide that seeks to block the historical continuity of Mesoamerican culture. And the greatest achievement of the de Indianization movement is to convince large parts of the Mesoamerican population to renounce their identity as members of a specific indigenous group. Separation from our cultural patrimony is a culmination of the de Indianization process, and it disrupts the scope in which cultural continuity is possible. And here is a concrete example of the de Indianization process. Almost all people in Mexico or of Mexican descent know something about the pre colonial world. For example, in elementary schools in Mexico, we are taught about the quote unquote great ancient Maya, the Aztec, the Olmec cultures. And there is a lot of pride in the past, but we're also taught that anything indigenous is something supposedly dead, no longer existing, and apart from us. We're also taught that the Mesoamerican civilization was destroyed by the European invasion and that the remaining indigenous populations have no place in contemporary Mexican society. Something that we are not taught enough, though, is to recognize the historical connection to Mesoamerican culture and its ongoing continuity. But despite the creation of the imaginary Mexico, there is also what Bonfil Batalla names the Mexico Profundo, which he defines as a Mexico that originates from Mesoamerican civilization and that through the process of cultural continuity continues to understand the world and organizes human life from a Mesoamerican perspective or cosmovision. The Mexico Profundo is present in both people who recognize themselves as indigenous, but also through the numerous Mesoamerican traits that continue to be present within the so called de Indianized collective of Mexico. Mexico Profundo is also described as existing in resistance to westernization. This resistance can be enacted by either remaining silent or by actively rebelling, depending on what may be more convenient, as informed by the over 5 centuries of indigenous resistance to the oppressive colonial structure. The resistance of the Mexico Profundo can be observed through again the continuity of Mesoamerican civilization. For example, as mentioned before, through the continued use of milpa agriculture, food waste, housing, and even medical practices. Another example of resistance is the use of indigenous languages, particularly in the names of certain geographical locations that continue to retain their names in indigenous languages as their official designation in resistance to the Spanish crown and the Mexican nation state as they wanted to introduce new official names. For example, the Popocatépetl. The continuity of using indigenous names for geographical locations is described as an accumulation of knowledges that expresses and condenses the knowledge base of Mesoamerican civilization. For example, the natural elements that characterize a space, its history, its use, and whom it may belong to. These names are also seen as solid points of reference that prevent the erasure of the basic structure of thought through which it has been possible to understand the world and one's place in it. The main argument of Bonfil Batalla is that there continues to be a prominent presence of Mesoamerican agriculture in Mexico, even within groups of people who do not recognize themselves as indigenous because of the process of de-Indianization, and that it is valuable to recognize and value the continuity of Mesoamerican culture in itself, and that it will also be helpful as we navigate current sociopolitical issues. And he further adds that just because there has been a change in the way that people identify themselves, it does not mean that there has been a loss of Mesoamerican continuity in Mexico and its people.